Along with Trump 2.0 comes Tariffs 2.0, and the squawkers are letting everyone know how bad this will be for the economy. Again. Before we address the tariffs in the new administration, let's take a look back at our previous comments on the subject. The following is an abridged version of an episode that was netcast on May 18, 2018, in anticipation of Trump's tariffs. For the full episode, visit jacobinbrothers.com. This is Jacobin Brothers Live. Today is Tuesday, May 15, 2018. I am Mark, along with my brother James, and we are the Jacobin Brothers.
Good morning. Welcome to Jacobin Brothers Live. Coming up on today's program, Tariffic trade deals. That's Tariffic trade deals. We take a quick look at the exciting worlds of taxes, tariff, and trade. It's been in the news a lot lately because of our 45th president, Donald J. Trump. And coming up on today's program, I'm going to be introducing a cast of fascinatingly interesting characters to you, such as George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, NAFTA, the WTO, trade tariffs, and yes, the War of 1812.
And the one thing they all have in common is that they have their picture on money.
Not Alexander Hamilton anymore. Did he get replaced by Susan B. Anthony or Harriet Tubman?
I believe Harriet Tubman is due to replace him, but it was kind of a joke. I don't think Trump or Obama have made it onto money yet either.
Yeah. I think it'll be quite some time before either of those two gentlemen.
Trump will just print his own money.
In the news a lot over the last few weeks, you've been hearing a lot of noise about an oncoming, quote, trade war and how dangerous it is for current administration to approach trade like this, so on and so forth, correct?
That's correct.
We're going to explain to you what a tariff is. Mark, what is your impression? What do you think a trade tariff is?
It's a tax on imports and exports.
That's correct, because there will be a quiz later. And you and the audience, feel free to play along at home. Now, what is the purpose for any country to level a tax on goods being shipped into their country?
It's a form of economic protectionism in the event that those goods and services can be produced and delivered cheaper than they can locally. Common wisdom is that by introducing a trade tariff, you will now motivate businesses to shop locally.
That's correct, and it strengthens your local economy at home, and it also strengthens the economy of whom you're buying from. A phrase I like to use is, the rising tide rises all boats. Now, I didn't make that up, but I think it's applicable here in this situation. President Trump, a few weeks ago, announced a 25% tariff on imported steel and a 10% tariff or tax on imported aluminum. Now, everyone's head in the so-called investment, professional economic commentary business, their heads almost spun off of their shoulders because they stated with absolute certainty that this would lead to inflation, a rise in the misery index, a loss of jobs, and a possible shooting war with China. Now, I'm not going to call into question the integrity of these commentators, but a quick search of corporate documents on who owns some of these media companies shows that they have a direct interest in not supporting the current administration's trade deal. I'm not saying that they're biased or they're paid off. I'm just saying that I'm not being paid by anyone to say what I'm saying.
Ain't that the truth?
Exactly. Ain't that the truth? In fact, maybe if they would pay me, I'd go ahead and change my opinion ever so slightly. We're going to talk about government and the administration as we see it. We're not going to look at it through the lens of Saturday Night Live, meaning anti-Trump stance, or through the lens of Sinclair Broadcasting or Fox News, meaning a pro-Trump stance. I'm taking a look at this from the audience standpoint, how it affects us. If the president's administration does something that's foolish or foolhardy, I'm going to go ahead and point that out. But at the same time, if this administration is doing something, however quietly they're doing it or how badly they're handling the messaging, I'm also going to point that out. So, Mark, do you know here in the great United States of America when we started, I guess, a so-called trade war, the rest of the world?
I couldn't say.
In the year of the Jacobin 1789, a fellow by the name of George Washington signed the second piece of legislation ever introduced in the United States of America. Back then, and this is going to shock people, there was no such thing as an income tax. And an income tax now is how the government gets the majority of their revenue to pay all of our bills. It's been recently reported that the last 2 fiscal years, one under Mr. Obama and one under Mr. Trump, the United States government has collected more taxes than ever, but we're in more debt than ever. But back in 1789, the only way for the government to pay the interest on the war bill for the Revolutionary War was to tax imports from other countries, because that was the only source of revenue, that and the voluntary participation of the states. Now, that has since changed. You may have heard of a fellow by the name of Alexander Hamilton.
That's right. He invented the telephone.
Alexander Hamilton invented the telephone.
Or invented the treasury. I get confused on that one.
Alexander Hamilton's first phone call would have been to George Washington, and to explain to him that to get the fledgling young republic of the 13 colonies transformed into states, we had to have a revenue base. And to do it differently than the European countries or the Far Eastern countries, they wanted to make it the fairest way possible. Hence was born capitalism. And a brief explanation of capitalism is this. If I'm selling you an internet radio show for $10, and it's the only radio show, and you want to hear it, you've got to pay the Jacobin brothers $10 to listen to it. But if our neighbor starts up a radio show and is charging $8, now the public has an option. They can still purchase our more expensive radio show, or they can purchase the cheaper one. Now, we have two choices. We can stick to our guns and say our show is better, pay the $10, or we can adjust to the demands of the market, of the free market.
Actually, James, I'm going to contest your definition of capitalism there. But what you described is the free market, when you have two choices, two desirable choices, and those two choices compete for your business. Capitalism is when a conglomerate comes in and buys both of those radio stations, charges you $10 for one and $8 for the other, and takes the profits no matter what.
You've just described crony capitalism, but what I was talking about was pure capitalism, the way it was originally intended, to allow the average Joe American citizen to get a leg up and become upwardly mobile.
But that's free market. That's not the strict definition of capitalism. Capitalism is the pooling of capital.
This is correct. And the pooling of capital for the first time in world history was now going to be encouraged to be pooled by private citizens who, yes, if they pool enough capital and they incorporate and they merge with other companies, they can get a much stronger toehold and leverage the market a lot.
And this is an important distinction. That's why I bring it up. People talk about the free market and capitalism as if they are one and the same, and they conflate the two. And the bad things about capitalism make the free market guilty by association. And this is an important topic when we have future shows about economics.
In the end, the more choices the consuming public has, the more it's going to force people like us to either put on a better radio show or to adjust our prices. And yes, Mark, you are correct that to start the radio show, we had to pool our money together to buy these microphones from China so we could then compete with all of the other internet podcasts and so forth. Part of the job of the United States president is to protect the country in all ways. In fact, they take an oath saying so. And it's not just to protect the country in times of war, but it's also to look out for the economic interests of the country, the health and well-being of the economy. This is why we grant so much leeway to the president to control the economy.
Let's take a break.
This is Philip A. Buster. My friends call me all the time. Jacobin Brothers is a listener-supported operation. It is not owned by some giant corporation pushing an elitist agenda. There's no billionaire paying the bills and telling them what to say. Although, I might not complain if there was. Jacobin Brothers speaks for the people and is the people. Show your support by visiting jacobinbrothers.com. Click the donate button and throw the boys some scratch. I'll be glad you did. jacobinbrothers.com.
President Trump, he just announced more or less sanctions or tariffs, specifically almost on China, to tax or tariff steel at a 25% clip and aluminum at a 10% clip as it enters the ports of the United States of America. The big pushback to that is this. that it will rise steel prices around the world, the manufacturers and the middlemen and the producers of products to include automobiles, household appliances, and I even saw one talking head say tin cans, soup cans. Anyways, I digress.
Announcer's talking about tin cans. He's a little behind the times.
I believe he is behind the times, at least from his physical appearance. He looked like. And that person is correct that it will temporarily rise prices. I had a chance to have a conversation with someone who owns a couple precast manufacturing plants, someone in the big concrete and the big steel business. And they confirmed to me that, yes, it will temporarily rise prices, and he has temporarily passed on the cost to his customers. The main problem that led President Trump to do this had nothing to do with China. It had to do with the steel industry worldwide. The biggest problem was Turkey, because Turkey had nailed down and almost got a monopoly on taking advantage of the poor American policy on steel. My common sense mind, it made sense to me that, yes, prices would initially go up, but getting back to the free trade / capitalism conversation, prices initially go up, but then that will force the foreign manufacturer like Turkey or China to do one of two things: either accept the fact that less of their product will be coming to America or a smaller profit margin, or push their prices down, which would then push prices down worldwide, which would be better for who? Us, the end user consumer. So I was looking around, Mark, for an economic expert that I could quote, someone who knows more about this than I do. And I landed on my good friend, Alexander Hamilton. So here's what Alexander Hamilton said in 1789. The domestic manufacturer has attained to perfection. Invariably, the product becomes cheaper. What that means is, if you have more options as a consumer or more options as a big steel purchaser, eventually the price goes down, and further on down the trough, more jobs will be created. In the 1974 film Godfather Part 2, Hyman Roth says to Michael Corleone, "Michael, we're going to be bigger than U.S. Steel." From 1972 backwards to about the early 1900s, U.S. Steel was the biggest corporation and the most profitable corporation around. Now, if you take a look in the Pittsburgh area, you've seen steel manufacturing plummet. You've seen these jobs just flee overseas. And what the president is trying to do is reinvigorate the economies and the mass steel production here in America. And he's doing this for a couple of very good reasons. Mark, can you guess one of the reasons?
Votes?
Well, I guess I ran right into that. Yeah, I imagine votes would be one of it. I don't know a politician who doesn't want to get reelected. However, if you take the name President Trump out of it and say insert the name President Obama. President Obama, during his administration, obviously him and Mr. Trump have different styles. Mr. Obama goes through the traditional channels, through the WTO, bureaucratic international process, and things move much slower. Now, this may surprise people. President Obama did put tariffs on China, and he did put tariffs on specific products. Mr. Trump is putting a tariff on a whole industry. Mr. Obama was looking at more of a low risk, low yield. Mr. Trump is looking at high risk, high return. I don't know if you noticed in the last few years, Mark, the price of your tires that you buy for your car went down by about 2%. Did you notice that?
Not where I buy tires.
That's correct, because it's only 2%. It's marginal. You're not going to notice that. Well, Mr. Obama put a tariff on the international importation of tires, not rubber, but specifically tires, hoping to push down the cost of tires and provide jobs. It did provide a nominal amount of jobs, but on top of that, it didn't really do much for the consumer because, like you said, you didn't notice it. So what Mr. Trump is doing by taxing the entire industry of imported steel, he's looking down the road to 3 or 4 years from now, when the market corrects itself, that you're going to see a massive reduction in the prices, not on an individual product, but on an array of products, to include the cars you buy, your coffee machine, and also your soup cans. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts on this? Do you think it's going to make much of a difference?
I take a much broader view of trade tariffs. The economics of a tariff are very contemporary, which means you can't argue for or against a tariff
in the conceptual sense. You always have to look at the specific conditions in which a tariff is imposed. A tariff imposed one year may have positive results. The same tariff imposed in a different situation may have opposing results or undesirable results. To me, the short answer is there's no way to know until you do it. It's like a collapsing wave function of a particle.
I'm glad you brought that up. You said a specific function. Let me give you a couple specific numbers. In the fiscal year 2017, we imported $515 billion worth of steel from China. We exported $130 billion worth of steel, leaving what's called a trade deficit between us and China to the tune of $375 billion. Not good. Not good at all. So President Trump specifically wants to address that thing. This is not a trade deal. You've heard President Trump rail against the WTO and rail against NAFTA. And if this sounds familiar, maybe my favorite modern politician, Ross Perot, was saying the same things in 1992 in his argument against NAFTA. Let's take a brief look at NAFTA and why the president wants to dismantle. There's some indicators that NAFTA is not working. And what NAFTA did was open the borders to Canada and Mexico and allow big trucks with cargo to travel back and forth freely. Okay, that's the simple version without a tax. And that was supposed to increase jobs in America, lower prices, but also prop up the economy of Mexico so they could then reinvigorate their economy, which would lead to more people who live in Mexico staying in Mexico and not have the need to leave their homeland to seek a better economic life in America. In the last 18 years since NAFTA was put into place, does it seem to you that more people are immigrating to the U.S. from Mexico or less?
Well, I don't know about people, but I do know that the amount of money sent back by people working in the United States to their relatives in Mexico is the number one line item of the Mexican GDP. NAFTA, in one sense, was a success.
It was a success for the corrupt Mexican government and the cartels who were siphoning off half of that money to begin with, but that's another show. But to me, it seems like a failure for the people of Mexico because they didn't get what they were promised, which was a thriving economy in their country of birth, which forces them to, I don't know, I've never met a person in my life who wants to voluntarily leave when they were born to seek a better life. So it doesn't seem to me that it was successful for the Mexican people, and it doesn't seem to me that it was effective for the American worker either. Mr. Trump, not addressing NAFTA, but he's trying to raise the economy worldwide. Now, this is what NAFTA was supposed to do. It was sold to us under this premise. Yes, some American jobs will go overseas, but the rest of the third world countries and developing countries will become stronger, which will then rise the tide back up of the American manufacturer and the American working woman and man. This did not happen. We become a consumer-based economy. What President Trump, to answer your question, he's directly trying to address that deficit, that worker deficit. And he's not doing it through what George W. Bush called, or George Papa Bush called, voodoo economics, which was trickle down. He's doing it through old school brick and mortar, bring jobs back to America without damaging the economies of our favorite trading partners like China. The second reason President Trump is doing this, if we're getting 2/3 of our steel from China, there's a lot of tensions with China right now. Just 4 months ago, people were worried about us going to war with China. China is preparing for a war. I don't know if they're preparing for a war with us. They're probably just looking to strengthen their position in their part of the world. But last week, China put into the ocean their first domestically built aircraft carrier. They've built an island in the China Sea to have a base for forward operations for whatever sea war they're planning with whomever. Let's say for whatever reason, President Trump fulfills the prophecy that most people, or a lot of people say is crazy, and we end up in a war with China. We're going to be 2/3 behind China in the production of steel, which produces military armaments and ships and so forth, right? So he may be looking at that. I don't think he is. One of the great deterrents of people attacking us during World War II or getting us involved in World War II, probably said best by Admiral Yamamoto, who we educated in America before he went back to Japan and bombed Pearl Harbor, said there's no way we can keep up with the industrial and production might of America. And that proved to be true. And we ended up victorious in World War II due to our industrial manufacturing strength. Now, we have lost that. Do you think it's a possibility that President Trump is looking at the whole board here, both economic and national defense?
When it comes to divining the method to President Trump's madness, no one has been right. There's no way to know when he's actually working according to plan or when he's working according to a 3 a.m. Twitter fit. So I'll reserve judgment.
I'm also reserving judgment. Now, oftentimes when there's a strong economy, they want to credit it to the current president. In the 80s, it was Reagan. In the 90s, it was Clinton. In the 60s, it was Kennedy and Johnson. The Depression was blamed on Hoover. And I always say, someone please give me a couple examples of what the president does to affect the economy. It's very narrow. But one of the things the president has the authority to do, which you can directly test and measure the success or failure of, is to level tariffs on imports, Mark. So we're going to be able to tell within 6 to 18 months, based on the manufacturing uptick of steels, based on job increases in the regions of this country that produce steel and all the filler jobs that feed into that. So come the 2020 election, we'll be able to point directly to this policy by this administration and say, this failed or this was a success. And we're not going to have to wait 10 years for it to happen. Some detractors of the steel import are the tech companies. They're looking at it as a tax on tech because most of their products have some form of steel or aluminum in them, cell phones, computers, and so forth. One of my favorite people, Gary Shapiro, the CEO of CES, which is the Consumer Electronics Show, which I've been to a couple times in Vegas, comes out heavy against this because it's going to increase the cost of their materials to produce these cell phones. And I say, so be it. They should just take some of the profits they're making from mining all our data and actually have to actually compete in a free and open market.
Let's take a break.
I'll leave it up to you, the audience, to decide. Is what the current president doing with his tariff on steel and aluminum, is this a terrific trade deal, or is this the stupidest thing that a president could do? I look forward to hearing your feedback. Jacobin Brothers, signing off.